Next step, now that we've got 3 pedals in this vehicle like it should be, we're gonna continue on with more of the interior mods. I wanna get this thing ready to go for the interior so that when the engine trans comes back in, it's basically done. So the next thing we're gonna do, I'm gonna pull that pedal box assembly back out, we're gonna pull the column back out, and I'm finally going to lop off the ears of this dash on both sides. Once I do that, then I can start to plate the sides of these things, make it look all decent up in there, and then I can start building the seat frame as well. All right, so what I'm trying to do here when I cut this thing is I'm trying to get a clean enough cut coming this way with it, more of a diagonal off of this A-pillar here, because I want to shape it just a little bit to make it look a little bit more natural as to where the edge comes. I don't want it to look like somebody just hacked it off, essentially what I'm doing here. So I want it to look more natural, so I got to kind of think about this for a minute to figure out exactly where I want to cut this line. That way I can, of course, mimic it on the other side as well. That's going to be the key to this whole thing. I still want it to flow somewhat decent with this thing on here. So I feel like I've got a good starting point here. I'm just going to go ahead and make this cut. Sometimes that initial cut is always the hardest part. Just get the cut done. We'll get this ear off of here and I'll be able to see what remains and see what I can do as far as cleaning it up and making it look a little bit more decent. You can always massage it a little bit. Of course, you can't really put metal back easily, but I think we're on the right track here. Ah, a sense of physical relief pulling that ear off of there. There we go. Now this dash is so much less obtrusive. Look how much room we have to get in here now. Oh, that feels better. All right, now we're gonna have to do some work with a flap disc to help clean this thing up, give ourselves a nice shape to work with, and then we can go ahead and weld directly to that with a new sheet of panel. A new sheet of panel, absolutely. So I got one side done here, went ahead and chopped off the excess and then plated it and then welded it all up and smoothed it and cleaned it. I think, you know, the whole goal when I was doing this was to try to make it to where it didn't look like somebody had just lopped off the end there. I wanted to make it look a little bit cleaner than that. And in the end, when it's all done, I think that's exactly what it looks like. It looks like somebody lopped it off and just plated the cover. But you can't win them all. I think that's still going to work out okay. It's not the worst thing in the world. I still think it looks somewhat decent. If you didn't know the ears were there, it probably wouldn't strike you as badly. Now we're working on the opposite side, and the tricky thing now is to try to make them match between the two of them. So what I'm gonna do is I've got this thing cut now. I'm gonna go ahead and make a little template for this. I'll show you how I do that. We'll get this thing cut out, welded on, grind it flush, and then we'll kind of compare side to side. I think it'll come out all right. So we're gonna go ahead and make a quick template here for the metal that's going to cover up this dash panel. And I'm gonna show you a quick trick here that's an old trick. A lot of you may know it already, but some of you haven't seen it yet. And this is a really nice technique to make a quick template out of paper. It actually helps to have some gloves that are a little bit dirty because it helps the transference. What you do is you take a clean sheet of paper, you place it where you need it, try to get it as centered as possible, exactly where you want it. And then all you do is just press around the edges of where exactly you'll need to make your cuts. Just press with your fingers. You can also do this with a screwdriver or something of that nature. I find the gloves works really well though. So there you go. Basically you just press around the edges there and the dirt transfers and then makes you a perfect template of what you need to cut. So we're gonna go ahead and get this thing cut out of metal, get this thing tacked into place and get it welded on. So there it is, the pedal assembly is finally painted and reinstalled back in the vehicle. Hopefully I do not have to take that back out again. I went ahead and put the column back in as well, and the reason for that is some positioning here. What I'm going to be doing today is I'm going to be building the seat frame to mount my aftermarket seats. I got these kind of bucket style seats. I'm really excited. I think they look fantastic. I think they're gonna look great in here and be really comfortable. So I need to build a seat frame so that I can mount those. And hopefully I can do so in a relatively simple fashion, make this a quick install, get these seats in here so I can check all my final positioning with my seating, and then we can kind of move forward from there. Now the seats themselves, they mount on rails. So what I'm going to do is basically just build a rectangular box that spans the whole area of where the original seat went. And then once that rectangular box is built, then I can actually mount the seat rails to that frame. Hopefully I can do so in a simple fashion. All right, that's about as basic as it gets. You got a big giant rectangle here. I built some standoffs in the corner, and also some mounts in the front for it to hang off of. And that way the box itself is fairly level. It's actually pointing a little bit upward in the front like most seats generally will do. I think the only thing I want to change here is I want to go ahead and cut the corner off of this and plate it so that it's not such a sharp edge here. I don't want to catch my leg on it or anything. I think I'll cut the corners here, cap that. But basically now at least we've got a base to work off of. So now I need to get my seat sliders out and start measuring those and start mocking up the seats in here. So now we get to one of the more interesting aspects of this whole project, and that is the transmission and specifically the clutch that's going on there. So for the transmission on here, if you watch the earlier episodes, you know that I went with the MA5 transmission out of the 08 Chevy Colorado. Now the reason I did that was because the TR6060 that comes behind the Challenger is equipped with a dual mass flywheel, and I don't really want a dual mass flywheel. I just want a regular single mass on there. And I thought it'd be a little bit cheaper to go this route, and there's a lot of these transmissions out there that are available for a good price right now. So I figured that if I broke it, I'd be able to get another one cheap enough, be a quick swap in and out. Now, there's some trickiness that comes with that. The reason I chose this transmission is because it has a detachable bell housing, and that bell housing is interchangeable with other ones from different models. And it turns out that a 3.7 liter Jeep Liberty from the 0304 model will bolt onto that transmission. Now that's important because that bell housing has the exact same bolt pattern as the bell housing for the Hemi engine. However, that does come with its own complications because you are now limited to clutch size by that bell housing. So as you can see here, I have a flywheel from a 3.7 liter Jeep Liberty that actually has the exact same bolt pattern as a Hemi crankshaft, and it bolts right on. So that's really nice. But as you can imagine, a 3.7 liter Jeep Liberty does not create the kind of power that a 6.4 Hemi will. So how am I going to achieve holding on all that power? Well, that's where we're getting into the little bit more experimental phases right now. So I managed to find online a stage 4 Jeep Liberty 3.7 clutch on there. Comes with a 6-puck style clutch that would probably work pretty well. However, the hub spline is a completely different pattern than the transmission on the Colorado. Now that's definitely an issue I should have seen coming, and I honestly had it put out of my mind because I wasn't really even thinking about it. And then when it showed up, I'm like, hey, that doesn't work at all. Now what am I going to do? Because I need the actual bolt pattern from the pressure plate to match up to the flywheel, but I could maybe use a different disc. So I started doing a little bit more research and I measured the diameter of this clutch disc, and it's 10.5 inches. Now, interestingly, what I found out is that most LS clutches are at 10.5 inch diameter. And also a lot of Mustang clutches are 10.5 inch diameter. And interestingly, on this transmission, it has a 26 spline 1.1 diameter input shaft. Hey, what do you know? That's the exact same input shaft as used in a lot of other transmissions as well. So there was a lot of interchangeability. In fact, I was able to find from this exact same manufacturer a clutch disc that is visually identical to this and physically identical, but has the correct center hub. So there it is. You can see that visually they are basically identical. They have the exact same clutch friction material on them. However, this one has the correct hub diameter and spline count. So now we can install the clutch on the vehicle. And the only other thing of note here is that because I am using that transmission, I wanted to make sure that I've used the correct pilot bearing in there. So what I did was I got the pilot bearing for the 08 Colorado transmission, and it is actually very close to fitting in the Hemi crankshaft. All I had to do was mount a little spacer in there to take up a little bit extra gap, tap that into place. So now I have the actual correct pilot bearing in there as well. So the input shaft will be supported properly the entire time. So our next step is go ahead and get this clutch and pressure plate installed onto the flywheel. One of the things I purchased here was I got one of these clutch alignment tools. I got this thing off of Amazon for like $2.50. So really nice setup there. It'll help me to align the clutch disc in here. Now you can definitely install a clutch disc without an alignment tool, as long as you visually line up the clutch disc with the center of the flywheel. I've done it before. It's really not that difficult to do. However, if your clutch disc is off to one side or the other, you will not get that transmission to bolt into place, and you'll have to take it all the way back apart again. So clutch alignment tool is always recommended. All right, there's a few things you want to do when you're installing a clutch pressure plate. The first of which is to make sure that your clutch disc is centered in here as best as possible, and make sure you have free movement of your clutch alignment tool. That's how you know that your disc is actually centered as well as it can be. Now the next thing is that when you are tightening this clutch pressure plate, don't just ram this bolt down as hard as you can, then go to the next. Now what you want to do is you want to go a couple of turns here and do a crosswise pattern so that the whole thing gets torqued down evenly, and then it'll actually bottom against the flywheel at a certain point. And then you stop there, and that's when you go get your torque wrench and go and do your final torque on all your bolts. And you'll notice as it starts to tighten down that the clutch fingers themselves will start to depress. Like I said, do an even pattern. And as you're going, keep making sure that your clutch alignment tool still has free play. All right, so all my bolts have bottomed now. I still had good free play movement of the disc itself. Now I'm gonna go ahead and do my final torque spec. There we go. All right, so our pressure plate is completely torqued down. We have good free play movement of our actual clutch disc here. So we're ready to put this transmission on, and we got some other stuff to show you on that. So we've got that clutch pressure plate and disc on there. That is half the battle. Now the other half of the battle is how are we going to actuate that clutch properly? Well, we have a bit of a conundrum there because on a 3.7 liter Liberty bell housing, that is actuated through a clutch fork and release bearing with an external slave cylinder mounted to the bell housing itself. On the GMC or Chevy Colorado transmission, it's actuated by an internal slave. What I wanted to do was I wanted to still reuse this internal slave system because I like it. I think it is going to work really well. However, in order to adapt it with this new bell housing here, I had to drill a couple of holes in the side of the bell housing for our lines to come through. Now we have two different lines here. We have a bleed line, which this is going to run all the way up to the actual slave cylinder, or the master cylinder for the clutch itself. That way I can just put it right in there and actually self-bleed the system. I think it's gonna work out really well, be really nice. Now the feed system here is also going to come through the bell housing into the actual slave cylinder. But the question remains, how do you make it actuate correctly? Because as you can imagine, your distances for this transmission are not going to be correct for the application that I'm using. It's actually really difficult to find any information about these internal slaves out there. Now, one thing that people are going to mention when he talks about a throwout bearing or a clutch release bearing is air gap, that you want to have between a 1/16 of an inch or an 1/8 of an inch of air gap between the release bearing and the fingers of the clutch pressure plate. Interestingly, these style of release bearings do not have that. They do not have any air gap at all. So finding setup procedures on these as far as how much they need to depress was actually fairly difficult. I did find a video from a couple of years ago from Mantic Clutch, and they actually showed that you want it to depress about a 1/2 inch. Between a 1/2 inch to 5/8 of an inch, you want this thing to be depressed. That way it'll actuate properly when you step on the clutch pedal. So, right or wrong, that's the numbers I'm going with. Now, in order to get my measurements correct, I had to measure as far as where the release bearing sat in relation to the face of the bell housing itself. And I also had to measure where the pressure plate fingers are in relation to where the bell housing mounts up. Now, when I got that specification, I found that I actually needed to move this slave cylinder out a little bit from where it was. So I had to make a spacer. Let me tell you, making a spacer that is perfectly round out of a flat sheet of metal really isn't that much fun. I invite you to try it. It's just a great time, a great way to spend 45 minutes of your life making a perfectly round circle out of a piece of metal. Ironically, the spacer that I needed based on my measurements was exactly 3/16 of an inch, which just so happens to be most of the type of metal I have lying around is 3/16 plate. So that actually worked out extraordinarily well. So I've made my spacer here. I'm now going to install the slave cylinder into the transmission here. We're gonna hook up our feed lines on there, and then we're gonna get this transmission stabbed onto the engine. Let's get into it. I'm gonna be real careful with these lines because you do not want this thing to leak while it's in here. All right, so there's our bleed line. Again, this line will just feed up and into the master cylinder for the clutch, and then basically you just open the bleeder, set it down in the fluid itself, and just start pumping the clutch pedal, and it should self-bleed itself. That's the idea anyway. We'll hope that works out. All right, now we've got that on there. Let me show you how we're gonna hook into our main feed line. I got this special adapter fitting here. This is from Earl's Plumbing. Basically, it just clicks directly into the factory feed type setup here, but it connects to an AN fitting here, so you can then connect your AN line. So theoretically, this should just click right into place if I bought the correct fitting, which I really hope I did. All right, fitting is attached. We should be good to go there. I think we're in good shape. Now it's time to get this transmission bolted onto the engine. Now keep in mind, you will have to draw this in a little bit based on the fact that the clutch slave cylinder in there will need to be depressed and it has spring pressure against it. However, it should be nice, smooth drawing in. It should not be difficult in any way. If this is cocked or it all is having trouble pulling in, I'm going to pull it back off and take a look and see what I can see. All right, feeling pretty good about it so far. Everything's drawing down nicely. Just very slight resistance as expected. All right, very exciting time right now. The trans is actually bolted back to the engine with the clutch installed in there. It is time to put this engine and trans back in the truck, hopefully for good. Behold, a 392 Hemi in a C10. She is not small, especially once I get all that other stuff bolted onto it. But the engine is back in. I actually have some motor mount bolts in it for the very first time. Look at that, getting fancy. All bolted in. I still have to make the trans mount. That is not going to be a big deal. It's going to be very, very straightforward. Got the whole front end reassembled on there. The sway bar is back on, and also the steering is back on. So our front suspension is essentially ready to go. Also, one other quick point of note, you can see down in there, I've got the starter installed in there. I used a 3.7 liter Liberty starter, but I imagine it might be the exact same as a regular Hemi starter because honestly, that thing just bolted right into place with no issue. So I kind of imagine it might even be the same part number. So I'm not really worried about it being underpowered. It should spin this motor over with no problem, but I was really excited about how close and how tight it tucked to the block. I shouldn't have any issues with exhaust clearance. So very excited. I'm going to go ahead and install the coolant heater tubes. So I went ahead and purchased these aftermarket because, well, for one, they weren't actually available from Chrysler anymore, but for two, I didn't want to have to worry about buying used ones because there's a chance they could be rusty or corroded and stuff like that. So went ahead and bought a new set. I think it's good insurance. All I'm going to do is lube up these O-rings and slip them into place. Went ahead and tossed some of the accessories back on here. Oh yeah, you can really see it starting to take shape now. It just looks cool. So more work to be done, obviously. The AC compressor actually cleared with no issue. That's just fine. That looks close, but it's not. So that's just fine. But the alternator, on the other hand, we're definitely going to have to take some out of the frame here to make that work. I'll have to figure out a way to brace this up afterwards. But overall, it's fitting pretty well. Not bad, plenty of room. I went ahead and got those coolant tubes installed. You can see them back there for the heater. And the intake manifold is on there for good. So a lot of this is together for good. So we just need to continue with some more reassembly right now. All right, you guys, that's going to be it for this episode on the C10. I promise you there's a lot more C10 content coming soon. If you like what you've seen so far, please consider subscribing to the channel, and we'll see you next time on Reignited.